Hello, this is Rick Jordan. I'm the Church Resources Coordinator for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina. Welcome to today's webinar on Archaeology and the Bible, Friend or Foe? Our presenter today is Dr. Tony Cartledge. Dr. Cartledge has taught Old Testament, writing, preaching, archaeology, and ministry courses at Campbell University Divinity School since 2007. He has published hundreds of articles, along with a dozen books as the sole author and 3 other books as co-author. In addition to his teaching responsibilities at Campbell, Dr. Cartledge is contributing editor and weekly curriculum writer for the national publication Nurturing Faith Journal and Bible Studies. Dr. Cartledge and his wife Susan live in Cary, North Carolina. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Cartledge's presentation. If you have questions or comments to ask, you can enter them in the question box at any time during the presentation. We'll hold them till the end, but you can put them in at any time. The question box is at the bottom of your screen. If you'll scroll down to that, you'll see a box that says Q&A. Thank you for participation in today's webinar, and just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and will be stored on the CBF North Carolina Virtual Resource Library, which is on our website. Dr. Cartledge, welcome.
Thank you, Rick.
I'm so glad you're with us today, and you have an interest in this subject of archaeology. I wonder how that began. How did you, before you begin your formal presentation?
Well, Rick, I think anyone who's interested in the Bible pretty much has to be interested in the lands where the Bible, where things took place, and not only interested in the land, but what's under the land. Archaeology helps us get as close as we can to that period, to the biblical period over, of course, a couple of thousand years. And it's been something I've been interested in for a long time. I've been reading Biblical Archaeology Review, I think, ever since it came out. But when I was younger, family responsibilities, things like that, I was never able to actually participate in it until recently. And in 2015, my wife Susan and I participated in our first field experience on a dig at Lachish. And since then, we've been back 2 other summers to dig, and found it to be quite enjoyable. It was a real joy last year to take some students from Campbell, as well as some other friends, to Jezreel to participate in a dig.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for sharing that and for sharing your presentation with us today. So you can go ahead then and share your screen with your PowerPoint. And again, for those who are joining us, if you have questions during this, just put it in the question and answer box, and I will ask them of Dr. Cartledge at the end. We're probably going to have about a 45-minute presentation, and then we'll have question and answers at the end of that.
All right, we ready to go?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay. Well, friends, it's good to be with you. And I'm glad that you also have some interest in archaeology as well as in the Bible. So the presentation today is designed to do a brief review of some of the history of archaeology in the Middle East, and sort of a look at some of the things that archaeology can tell us about the Bible, and some things that it can't, and some places where archaeology may tell a different story than the Bible. One of the reasons that archaeology is so important is that it is what it is. It's frozen in time. It doesn't have a theological agenda. It just is what it is. And so as we find things and try to interpret them, we don't have an overlay of an attempt to tell a story in the same way that we do in the Bible. Because the Bible, as much as we love it, we have to recognize was written for a purpose. And so it has a theological agenda. And so the stories are shaped so that they make the point the author is trying to make. And when we look at findings from archaeology, we don't have that overlay. So there's a sense in which it brings us back a little closer. So let's think briefly about the sort of the history of how archaeology developed in the early years and some of the early real contributions that came out of it, even though they weren't in controlled excavations. Perhaps the earliest sort of time period was what we call the antiquarianism, or grand tours, kind of a time of colonial exploitation. If you'll pause, excuse me just for a minute, this the menu, well, I can't do it. The menu on my screen is obscuring the screen. Oh, thank you, Rick, if you did that. The earliest archaeology was really more like treasure hunting. It did produce some real treasures, though, including the Rosetta Stone. This was first found in 1799. It was discovered by a Frenchman named Pierre Bouchard. He was an engineer assigned to rebuild fortifications at Rosetta, which is an Egyptian city, after Napoleon had taken Egypt from the Mamluks back in 1799. The inscription, as you can see, is written in 3 different languages. It commemorates the anniversary of the coronation of a Ptolemaic pharaoh named Ptolemy V Philopater in 196 BCE. It's really dull reading, but the nice thing about it is that it's written in Greek, Demotic, and in Egyptian hieroglyphs. Up until that point, scholars had been largely stymied by hieroglyphs, but they knew how to read Coptic. And Demotic is sort of a simplified version of hieroglyphs. So since they could read the inscription in Demotic and then compare it with, in Coptic rather, and then compare it with the others, this proved to be the primary key to deciphering hieroglyphics, which enabled us to read many other texts. Texts were painted or inscribed on virtually every surface of hundreds of temples and thousands of tombs throughout Egypt, as well as on parchment, and many of those parchments have been preserved in the dry heat of Egypt's desert landscape. So we have access to lots of ancient material from Egypt, from hymns and poetry and wisdom literature to a lot of very boring list of accomplishments that kings like to take credit for. Palestine was not an easy place to visit back then in the 1800s. It was officially part of the Ottoman Empire, had been for hundreds of years. It was marked by some tribal uprisings, feuds between local sheiks. Travel was dangerous, but there were a few adventurers and missionaries and scholars that entered into the area. And we'll talk about some of them soon. But the next area that we might want to think about is kind of a period in archaeology that was called Bible lands archaeology. In the 19th, early 20th centuries, this was focused mainly on Mesopotamia and Egypt because Palestine was such a difficult place to go. And some of the major finds from them include this Behistun inscription that Karsten Niebuhr publicized. Obviously, he didn't discover it. It was up there on the side of a mountain, and it's huge. But he brought back pictures of it and impressions made with paper mache. This is also a trilingual inscription. It's written in Old Persian, Akkadian, and Elamite. It acclaimed the deeds of the Persian king Darius or Darius. Some dialects of Old Persian were still spoken, so much as the Rosetta Stone was the key to interpreting hieroglyphs. This proved to be an important key to the decipherment of cuneiform. Akkadian is the sort of official name of the cuneiform used by the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And so this was quite an important find. And folks like Henry Rawlinson, Austin and some others were quite important, Edward Hinks, in actually working out the translation. That's obviously still being refined. I read just recently another very small trilingual inscription had been found, which added a new verb to the vocabulary. So we're still learning things. There were a lot of excavations in Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, especially. This was where you would have found Babylon and Assyria in the ancient world. Paul Emil Botha uncovered what's called Dur Sharokin, or the city that was built by Sargon II. He claimed that it was a palace without rival. And as you can see from the description, it contained over 200 rooms around 3 different courtyards. And the figure to the right is something called a lamassu. This is also, a type of cherubim. When we speak of cherubim, it basically refers to a winged creature, often an animal, sometimes with a human head. In our church context, we tend to think of cherubim more as angels, and sometimes, unfortunately, based on gift store cards, as baby angels. But that's cherubim were actually could be pretty frightening looking creatures, and it was popular in Mesopotamia to have the body of a bull with the head of a person, who also had the horns of a bull, indicating royalty or divinity, along with wings. And these represented spirits. They were often put by the doorways, because they believed that evil spirits lived under the threshold of doorways. And so these were protected by putting up these representatives of good spirits or helpful spirits to guard against the evil spirits. So Botha found a lot of interesting things at Dur Sharakin. Austin Henry Layard was quite well known as well. He explored the city of Nimrud, which is also known as Kalhu. It was the biblical city of Kala. And this important city was first built by Shalmaneser I in the late 13th century, and it was later made into the capital by Ashurbanipal II around 911 BCE. And you recognize that this is a biblical period. This would be during the monarchy in Israel, both the united and the divided monarchies. This remained the capital until Sargon II moved it to Dur Sharakin, which we just looked at on the previous slide. And then after his death, Sennacherib, who ruled from 706 to 681 or so, moved the capital to Nineveh. And it remained there until the fall of the Assyrian Empire, which fell apart by around 599 BCE. Among the very fascinating things that Layard found are not only examples such as the beautiful ivory carving that you can see there, as well as the gypsum relief below of the king hunting lions, but also the famed black obelisk. If you look on the left of the screen and you see the tall, dark stone monument, this is called the Black Obelisk, and each of the panels has scenes from the rule of Shalmaneser III. And when they were able to read the inscription as well as look at the pictures, the larger picture is an expanded view of one of the panels in which that's supposed to be Israel's King Jehu, who is bowing and paying tribute to Shalmaneser III on this black obelisk. Whether Jehu ever went and bowed down or not is unclear, although he almost certainly did pay tribute to Shalmaneser after Israel began to fall under the influence of the Assyrians. So this was one of the particularly interesting things that Layard found there that relates to a biblical story. If you switch back over to Egypt, we'll find that one of the primary finds were the Amarna letters. These letters were written in Akkadian. You can see a tablet there that has Akkadian cuneiform in it, but they were from Egypt because at that time Akkadian was the international language. So Egyptian scribes had to learn Akkadian if they were going to communicate with people living in other lands. And these letters from Amarna, which was a city in Egypt, described relationships between Egyptian kings and Canaanite client kings in the 14th century. And this is a reminder that Egypt controlled much of the land that we think of as Israel for a great deal of its period. Egypt was the primary closest power, and even into the late Bronze Age and to some extent into the Iron Age, Pharaoh named Shishak or Sheshonk, depending on how you pronounce it, exerted a lot of influence in Palestine. There were there were small city states there, and they ruled at his pleasure. And these letters going back and forth were often complaining. Whoever had been appointed to be in charge of a city was complaining about encroachments from various people and complaining that Egypt didn't do enough to help them out and things like that. The earliest mention of Israel from a non-biblical source is found on the Merneptah stela. And on your screen, that's what you see on the left. It's called the Merneptah stela because it was erected by a pharaoh named Merneptah around 1207 BCE, probably not long after the most likely date for some sort of exodus from Egypt. The stela, by the way, is huge. It's hard to tell from this picture, but I've seen a picture of a person standing beside it, and it just totally dwarfed her. It must be 10 or 12 feet tall. And down at the bottom left, you can't really tell it there, but there are hieroglyphics that indicate that Merneptah claims to have defeated a people group known as Israel. They used a little sign to indicate whether you're talking about a people or talking about a city. And they used the little designator for people group. And he says that he defeated Israel, his seed is no more, in which he claims that he wiped out all the Israelites. Obviously, he was overstating, as did all of the kings in the ancient world. None of them admitted to ever being defeated. You might have a battle, and a Syrian king and an Egyptian king would both erect a stela saying they had won. So you can't always trust what you read on these stela. Also, we have the Hammurabi stela that you see at the right. This was found in 1901 at Susa, which is today in southwestern Iran. At that time, it was in the ancient world, it was a part of the Babylonian Empire. And it dates back to the time of Hammurabi, who ruled from somewhere around 1792 to 1750. And at the time it was found, and down below the top of the stele, if you look at it, at the top, the seated figure is Shamash, the sun god, and the figure standing to the left is Hammurabi. And this is supposed to portray Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god, Shamash. And then below, you can't really see it in the picture, but it's covered with cuneiform inscriptions reciting many, many laws. At the time it was found, this was the oldest known law code. We've found several others since then that are 400 or 500 years older. But there are some similarities between some of the laws and some of the Mosaic laws, such as the idea of an eye for an eye. There are also a number of differences. So some people have tried to use the Hammurabi stela to say that this is indication that Abraham, Moses rather, would have lived during this general time period because he knew some of the same laws. It's actually much closer to the period that would be assigned to Abraham, but an indication perhaps that these were common rules or laws that were found throughout the ancient Near Eastern area. Now, serious excavations in Palestine didn't begin really until the late 19th and early 20th century, so it hasn't been going on nearly as long. Then we had the emergence of what is often called the biblical archaeology movement. Many of these early people, their primary purpose was to use archaeology in an attempt to try the Bible, but it did begin to take on a more scientific approach. An early phase began with the work of people like Hester Stanhope, who was a British woman who actually, she wanted to find buried treasure at the Philistine city of Ashkelon. So she wasn't really much of an archaeologist because she was looking for treasure, but she did do an awful lot of digging and found some interesting things there at Ashkelon. Edward Robinson is sometimes called the first biblical archaeologist. And if you will look in the two pictures, you will see in the top picture a tree with a little donkey beside it and then something poking out of the wall. At one time, that was the top of an arch, or where an arch emerged from a wall, and the archway went across a gap there, and it had a staircase on it leading up to the Temple Mount. And so this became known as Robinson's Arch. Since that time, a lot of excavation has been done in that period. So where the donkey is standing would now be about 20 feet up in the air. And you can see Robinson's Arch now emerging from the wall over to the right. And so Robinson was one of the important early archaeologists. Charles Warren and Charles Wilson, perhaps the most impressive people of the early 19th century, especially for mapping. They mapped much of Jerusalem and Palestine through the auspices of an organization called the Palestine Exploration Fund. Warren in particular is best known for his exploration of Jerusalem's underground water system, which included a natural cavern that today is called Warren's Shaft. We always lean over and look down it when we are in Jerusalem on our tours of Israel. Two sort of unhappy things happened during this period that damaged some very important things. One of them is that in 1868, a large inscribed basalt stela that we now know as the Mesha stela, or the Moabite stone, was discovered by some Bedouin. And they recognized it must be valuable, so they wanted to sell it. They wanted a high price. Westerners started bidding against each other, and so the Bedouin thought, well, if it's worth that much, it must have gold inside. So they broke it into pieces in search of the gold. Fortunately, a plaster copy had been made before they broke it up, and afterward, various people were able to purchase most of the broken pieces, and so the inscription could largely be restored as a result of that. This is a stela that mentions relationships in the area at the time when Mesha was king of Moab, and speaks of offering sacrifices to his god Chemosh. The value of inscriptions then became established, and the downside of that is that some local antiquities dealers began hiring locals to produce forgeries of ancient inscriptions, and this was a bit of a setback because a lot of inscriptions came on the market and it was very difficult to tell if they were original or if they were forgeries. We still have some problem with that today. Another unfortunate story involves the Salome inscription, which you can see on the left. It was found actually up near or on the ceiling of this underground tunnel that's popularly known as Hezekiah's Tunnel, or also known as the Salome Tunnel. This is an underground tunnel that was cut through rock. It's 533 meters long. That is well over a quarter-mile long. It's crooked as a snake, and it delivers water from the Gihon Spring to the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem. It's associated in the Bible in 2 Kings 20 with preparations by King Hezekiah to protect the water system prior to the invasion by Sennacherib. Some have argued that the tunnel is actually older than that. In any case, the inscription was found by a boy who was attending a missionary school back when you could just go down there and play in it. It was faint and very hard to read because lime deposits had accreted on the surface over the years. But once the inscription became known, somebody sneaked into the tunnel and chiseled it from the wall and broke it into pieces in the process. It was later recovered by the Ottoman government in the home of a priest, I believe. And then it was sent to a museum in Istanbul, and that's where it remains to this day. Then the inscription itself does not mention Hezekiah or any other king, but it describes how the people who dug the tunnel started on either end and met in the middle. So it's quite an interesting thing. And one of these days, if you go to Israel with me, you can walk through Hezekiah's tunnel. Perhaps the first more scientific efforts at archaeology was done by Sir Flinders Petrie. Petrie actually didn't like Palestine. He had excavated the Giza pyramid in Egypt, and he was hired by the Palestine Exploration Fund to excavate in Palestine, and he excavated at Tel El Hesi. He mistakenly thought it was Lachish. It was probably Eglon. But the important thing is that it was Petrie who recognized that tells, these ancient mounds, contain layers of ancient civilizations stacked on top of each other, and that changing styles of pottery could be used to date the sequence from one tell to another. As I mentioned, he didn't really care for Palestine. He only stayed for 6 weeks before he went back to Egypt. He was replaced by an American named Frederick Jones Bliss, who began to build on his theories, though, concerning layers of civilization and pottery typology. And that was quite an important advance for people doing archaeology to begin to realize that you have these layers of civilization, one on top of the other. This same person, Bliss, along with an Englishman named R.A.S. McAllister from Ireland, actually, led major excavations at a number of sites in southwestern Palestine at places like Azekah, Gat, and Marishah. And then McAllister went on to direct excavations at Gezer. He is not a popular guy today because some of his methods involve just digging huge trenches and other things in which a lot of information was lost forever. But among the various things he found were the famed Gezer calendar, which you can see on the right. You can make out some of the Proto-Canaanite inscription on there. I'll mention this again later, but this is one of the very earliest examples of any sort of Hebrew writing. And you can see it looks pretty primitive, and it comes from probably about the 9th or 10th century BCE, a long, long time after Moses is credited with writing great long books. And so this was continued development in that area. Americans continued to be involved in archaeology, and even more so. A school called the American Schools of Oriental Research began and set up shop just outside the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem. You can visit it today at the Institute on Salah Eddin Street. And the first director, most prominent one, was William F. Albright. He didn't really do that much field work. He dug at Gibeah and Tel Beit Mirsim. And you can see pictures here of some of the finds from way back then in the 1920s. But Albright became sort of the public face and a leading scholar of what was called the biblical archaeology movement. He believed that archaeology confirmed most of the earlier biblical record concerning Moses and the Exodus and the conquest under Joshua. So he was one who was sort of a maximalist. He believed that archaeology tended to prove the Bible rather than otherwise. The biblical archaeology movement came to include other well-known archaeologists, including Kathleen Kenyon, Yohanan Aharoni, Nelson Glick, and others of that period. Biblical scholars like John Bright and George Ernest Wright were also strongly influenced by Albright. They were critiqued pretty strongly by other scholars and archaeologists, including Bill Devers, Thomas Thompson, John Van Seters, and others, who pointed out that archaeology had often been used poorly by those who wanted to prove the Bible, and often had been stretched to conclusions that it couldn't really support. So by the 70s and 80s, there were few scholars outside of more fundamentalist circles who still argued, for example, that biblical writings went as far back as the Middle Bronze period. Archaeology could not provide any evidence of Moses or 2 million slaves leaving Egypt, although we do have evidence that a lot of Semitic people lived in Egypt at various times. So by the 70s, the kind of the idea of biblical archaeology was giving way to a more objective and anthropologically oriented focus that came to be called by several names, including Syro-Palestinian archaeology, and some people call it processual archaeology because it follows a very careful process. This is mainly because biblical archaeology came to be seen as a more amateur affair with some poor standards of field work. It was often more theological than archaeological. One of the kind of mantras was we dig with a Bible in the left hand and a shovel in the right. And some people thought it was out of touch with developments in the broader field of archaeology, which is, much broader than just biblical, of biblical interest. There are archaeologists working all over the world. A new type of archaeology was developing that focused on using the scientific method, testing hypotheses, watching for clues of cultural change, trying to overlook bringing any ideologies to it, and just looking at what you could find and then interpreting it based on its own evidence, rather than saying, oh, this matches the Bible. This approach, by the way, what we call the Syro-Palestinian archaeology or New Archaeology or processual archaeology, was pretty much firmly in place by 1985. And this is largely the method that is commonly used today. So, what can we learn? Well, let's take a quick look. Archaeology can't really tell us much about the primeval history, the patriarchal narratives, the Exodus from Egypt, or the stories from Leviticus to Deuteronomy, other than just what we can glean about physical culture in that period. And it's mostly evidence of what life was like in Palestine, where most of the residents were what we today would call Canaanite. They never called themselves Canaanites, but that's what we call them. But one of the things that archaeology does is help us to recognize a number of anachronisms that indicate that many biblical stories were written long after they actually happened. For example, Genesis says that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham is typically put around, 1800 BC, something like that. But the Chaldeans are never mentioned in Babylonian records until the 9th century. They didn't control any territory until the 7th century. So the idea that the area of Ur was connected with Chaldeans was a much later idea, and that indicates that whoever was writing this was writing at a much later period of time. Genesis also refers to Gerar as a Philistine kingdom, but the Philistines did not arrive in Palestine until hundreds of years after the time of Abraham. So Philistines don't really belong in Genesis at all. Genesis has a number of stories in which camels are used as beasts of burden, but we have no archaeological evidence of domesticated camels. And we have lots of bones when we dig. We find lots of bones, and we find camel bones, but not before the 9th or 10th centuries, at least in Palestine. And those are at Timnah, way in the very southern part of the country where there were copper mines. And so whereas we don't really have any archaeological evidence that camels were used as beasts of burden, they were in common use when most of the biblical stories were probably written. And much of that would have been more like the 6th, 7th century or even later. Cities such as Beersheba and Ai that are mentioned in Genesis probably did not exist in the Middle or Late Bronze Age. They don't seem to have occupation layers then. Arameans are mentioned in Genesis, but not mentioned elsewhere before about 1200 BC. And then in the text, you have references to things like before any kings ruled over the Israelites, or an outrage in Israel, which betrays writing at a later time, after Israel had become a political entity. Someone writing Genesis during that period couldn't say before any kings ruled over the Israelites, because there weren't really any Israelites yet, or any kings for that matter. So there's some things that archaeology does to help us recognize anachronisms in the text. As far as evidence of Joseph in the Exodus, would we have any of that? There's abundant evidence that some Semitic people lived in Egypt throughout the 2nd millennium. One group of them actually gained quite a bit of influence, and they ruled Egypt from 1670 to 1550 before being driven out by more ethnic Egyptians. There were other Semites known to attain positions of responsibility. There's no mention of a Joseph, even by his Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah. And the Egyptians kept a lot of good records. We know a lot of very minor scribes and other people from ancient Egypt, but there's no mention in any of these records of someone named Joseph, no records of a 7-year famine after 7 years of plenty, no records of an exodus of 2 million slaves at one time. So these are biblical traditions that we just can't say we have any evidence of them in the archaeological record. There are Egyptian names. Names are authentic, as are a number of Egyptian loanwords, but we have pointed out that Egyptian influence continued in Israel well into through the Late Bronze Age and into the Iron Age as well. One interesting thing about the biblical record is that Exodus 1:11 says the Hebrews were building the cities of Pithom and Ramses, and the Egyptian records attribute those to Ramses II, who ruled from 1279 to 1213. And this is he was the father of Merneptah, whose Merneptah Stela is the first one to indicate the presence of a people named Israel outside of the Bible. So we can't prove Israelites made them, but we do, through archaeology, have evidence of ancient mud bricks found in Egypt. We can see how they were made. They were pressed into a wooden form, and then the form was removed. They were left to dry in the sun. And so we have lots of evidence of mud brick. I could hold up a chunk, if you could see me now, and show you some mud brick from Lachish and other places. We have evidence of buildings and things like that, but no way to prove that it was the Israelites who made them. Out of the 30 sites mentioned in Exodus, we only know where 2 of them are. Kadesh Barnea and Ezion Geber are both oases, but as far as we can tell, they were not occupied during that period. There are no towns in that area until about the 10th century. Exodus and Leviticus also talk about Edom and Moab being encountered along the way, but they didn't really exist as organized states until the 10th century at the earliest, and probably more like the 8th. They probably came into existence as states about the same time as Israel. Numbers 21 talks about a war with the Canaanite king of Arad, but excavations at Arad show that it wasn't occupied then, although it was many years later. So evidence from archaeology suggests that many of these narratives reflect more of a cultural memory than history. They may have in mind a victory or a conflict that may have happened 100 years ago, but in their memories, they may have replaced them and put them as taking place 300 or 400 years previously. And as I mentioned earlier, while the stories speak of Moses, writing these extensive laws, and many people believe Moses wrote the entire Pentateuch, the earliest examples of Hebrew writing in this very primitive sort of Proto-Canaanite script only appear in the 10th and 11th centuries, which would be long after Moses, and they tend to be very primitive and short inscriptions. Now, of course, if Moses wrote on parchment or papyrus scrolls, it's unlikely that those would have been preserved, but we just don't have a lot of evidence that Hebrew had fully emerged even as a language during this period of time. Canaanite, Hebrew inscriptions, it's hard to tell one from the other. So there are a lot of areas in which archaeology might cause us to, have some questions about the accuracy of the biblical stories. But there are some things that we can see as well. We've mentioned the Merneptah stela, which indicates a people known as Israel in Canaan. There's evidence of rapid growth of villages in the hill country, marked by signs of Israelite presence, such as a 4-room house, the collar rim storage jars, and an absence of pig bones. There were a lot of cities, biblical cities that are known, and they were, many of them were destroyed during that general period of what we think of as the conquest, but not all at once. It was more like over several hundred years. So it's more likely, archaeology would suggest, that the Israelites first moved into the central hill country, which, as you can see, is not the most appealing place. And from there, they began to spread out as they grew more powerful into the plains and to be able to attack some of the cities. This is some of the evidence to indicate Israelites. Archaeologists believe this collared rim jar was particularly popular among the Israelites, as well as what we call the 4-room house. This is an example from Hatzor. 4-room houses generally had more than 4 rooms, but you can see from the overlay that it's called that because there were usually 3 long rooms in the front and a crosswise room at the back. Any of those could be subdivided in various ways into different configurations, but they were generally, it was overall a basic 4-room floor plan on the bottom. You can see here artist's conception of a typical Israelite home during the Iron Age, which would have been the primary period when Israel had kings. We do have some evidence that supports biblical stories. This is something interesting that's recently come out. Last year at the American Society of Oriental Research meeting there were some papers read that indicates that Tel El Haman, which many people believe might be biblical Sodom. It's been known for a long time that it was a strong city. Had been around for thousands of years. It was one of the leading cities of the Middle Bronze Age, located just north and east of the Dead Sea, but it was leveled. It was utterly destroyed around 1650, but the only, what seems to have caused it was an airborne meteor blast, such as we have seen a couple of examples in Russia in the last 100 years or so. So there are little tiny glass particles. There's pottery that's fused together and things like that, indicating a really high heat and a shock wave that would have brought a lot of salt water from the Dead Sea into the area just north. And so this entire there's kind of a circular area that was the most well-watered area around. You'd think it would be really popular, but it was uninhabited for 600 or 700 years after that, which indicates that, who knows, this could have been behind the traditions of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed by fire and brimstone. Now, I recognize that I've just about run out of time, but I'm going to show you a few more pictures if you don't mind. Eilat Mazar thinks that this large structure at the top might be evidence for King David's palace. I will point out there are others who disagree. But at the picture at the lower right, this stepped stone structure may well be what's called the Millo, or the fill, that was built by Solomon. That's a big retaining wall that was used to sort of fill in between two hills in Jerusalem. This is the Dan Stela. It was actually found built into a wall later on, but it was probably originally erected by an Aramaic king named Hazael, commemorating a victory over Israel in a battle. And if you'll look about 2/3 of the way down, you'll see some letters highlighted with chalk, and that says Beit David, or the house of David. This is maybe the only extra biblical evidence we have of the name of David. We have in a number of cities like Megiddo evidence of ancient palaces built by Israelites, although this was originally attributed to Solomon. It's probably from Jeroboam II. And we have some amazing things like bullae, the clay imprint of ancient seals that have been found in controlled excavations. This one was found in the area known as the City of David, and this would have been the seal actually of Hezekiah. If you could read it in the ancient script, it says belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. The interesting thing about it is notice the ankh and the winged sun disk. Both of these are very Egyptian types of art, and you find that a lot in Israelite iconography. This also was found in a controlled excavation, and some people have argued that it belonged to Isaiah the prophet because it says La Yitziyahu, which means belonging to Isaiah, and then the bottom has the letters, the first 3 letters of Navi for prophet, but one is broken off, and it is more likely that it probably belonged to somebody named Isaiah, who was the son of Nabu. But there are some other evidence. I'm going to have to breeze through this. In Lachish, a place was found where there was a shrine inside the gate that may have been used for worshiping Yahweh, but during Hezekiah's reform, it appears that the horns were chopped off the altars, and not only that, but a stone toilet was dumped on top of it to desecrate the place, and then it was walled off. So this may be evidence that it took place during the period of Hezekiah, and might be physical evidence from archaeology of Hezekiah's reform. Also at Jezreel, we archaeologists have found a winery at Tel Jezreel. You can see on this picture on the lower part, Tel Jezreel and Ein Jezreel, and that looks toward the Jordan River and the hills of Ramoth Gilead. There are stories in the Bible about Jezreel indicating that Ahab had a military fortress there, had a house there, and he wanted a vineyard belonging to Naboth, which his wife Jezebel acquired for him. It turns out that in just the right place, there is a huge stone-cut winery that could have been used for, it definitely was used for making wine. But the thing is, it's in just the right place to have served a winery built by someone. Could it have been Naboth? Perhaps it could. This is just an overhead view of the same winery. And down to the right, you can see that's just in the right place. It's by the road that leads from Syria to Jezreel. And there's a story later of how King Jehu murdered the king of Israel and threw his body in the vineyard belonging to Naboth. So we have lots of intriguing stories like this that relate to the Bible. We also have found other bullae and seals, some of which we're pretty confident about. They're authentic. Others, there's still debate about whether they were forgeries, and these include the one on the left, Baruch, the son of Neriyahu. That would be Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch. You see another for King Ahaz, and another for actually the seal itself that could have belonged to Jezebel. Pretty amazing. So, is archaeology a friend or foe? Obviously, I think it's a friend. But its purpose isn't just to prove the Bible. It's to help us to understand ancient peoples and their cultures. As applied to the Bible, even when it demonstrates that some of the biblical narratives may be more cultural memory than historical fact, it helps us understand the situation and life of the people who produced the Bible, and perhaps help us to understand some of the reasons why they wrote it and understood it as they did. So I'll stop there, and we'll see if anyone has any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Cartledge. We do appreciate this. And we have one question that has been asked, well, a couple questions it looks like. One is, before the Bronze, a Bronze Age, Iron Age, what dates bracket these ages, and do metals play an important role in cultural archaeology? Do the metals present help to date excavations?
All right. I'll try to attach it. It says I'm trying to figure out how to get my my video back, and I don't know.
Okay. Look at the top of the screen. It says view options. It might be.
Okay, there it goes. All right. I have it. Okay, so the question again was, what are the dates for Middle Bronze Age, Iron Age, things like that?
Yes, and do the metals play an important role in cultural archaeology? Do they help date excavations?
Metals as in METAL?
Yes.
Yes, to some degree. If you are thinking historical eras, the Middle Bronze Age typically goes from about 2000 to 1500 BCE. We think of the Late Bronze Age as being around 1550 to 1200 BCE, and then the Early Iron Age begins around 1200 and goes on down to the way we date it is 586 to the beginning of till Israel went into captivity and during the exile. Metals can be helpful just in that they can be indicators. If you find something that's made of iron, you figure it's probably not, older than somewhere around 1200. You don't find as much of that as you would like because iron rusts and it disappears. We do find a lot of bronze, and of course, bronze continued in use even during the Iron Age. One of the interesting stories in Samuel says that the Philistines had iron and the Israelites did not yet. And so if the Israelites wanted anything made of iron, they had to buy it from the Philistines, and even had to get the Philistines to sharpen it for them. We don't use metal for dating as much as we use pottery. But, you know, we can look at a piece of pottery similar to this, and by the color of it, or by the shape of the jar handle or something like this, this gives us a good idea of when it may have been produced. For example, this is typical of the Persian period, and it's the pottery that helps us a great deal. But these days, carbon dating is being used more than anything for accuracy, and that has to be something that was originally organic.
Thank you. We had another question similar. You may have just addressed it, but can you give a quick synopsis of how the different ages, bronze, iron, etc., relate to the Old Testament story?
Well, you know, if you want to talk primeval history, of course, it would just be as far back as you can. But if we start with, say, Abraham, his period would have been along the Middle Bronze II period. The idea that the period that Genesis says the Israelites spent in Egypt would have been during the latter part of the Middle Bronze and the early Late Bronze Age. The period we think of as the conquest, or under Joshua, when Israel first comes into the land, would be kind of crossing over from the Late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. But especially what's called Iron I is often called the period of the Judges, from about 1200 to 1000. And then Iron IIA would be the beginning of the kingdom under Saul and David. Iron IIB, largely the period of the United Monarchy from 928 to 722 or so. And then Iron IIC would be just the period when the northern kingdom had been conquered by Assyria and the southern kingdom continued to exist as Judah. Then from there, you get into the Neo-Babylonian period, the Persian period, the Hellenistic period. You start using political terms instead of bronze and iron after that point.
We have a question that is more New Testament kind of era. And this is actually a question about the size of the cavity carved from stone in which the body of Jesus was laid. So what can archaeology help us with things like Jesus's death and burial?
Well, archaeology can show us a lot of ancient tombs. It can't tell us if any of them belonged to Jesus. The one in the garden, what's called the garden tomb, is a small room cut into a cliff that has just sort of a small entrance hallway, and then to the right, it's cut out, and there are maybe 2 benches where bodies would be laid on the benches. Some tombs were massive and had several rooms in them. Others were just large enough to put 1 or 2 bodies. And typically, tombs were reused. You would leave a body until it decomposed, and then you would gather the bones up, put them in a smaller box, and then you would have the bench available for the next person who died.
Mm-hmm.
Usually about a year in between.
Okay. Well, those are the questions that we have. So thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciate your time and your expertise that you're willing to share with us today.
Thank you, Rick. Glad to do it.